Okay, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. We're here for round 3 on Moed Katan. After round 2, we stopped after the Rishonim. You were talking about all the Rishonim that wrote Svarim and learned Avelos and Misa. You spoke about the Ramban and the Adam in depth. You could have gone on for another hour. But let's talk about some of the Achronim, the Svarim that were written by the Achronim, and get to the modern day Poskim, and then just a list, a contemporary list of all the Svarim. I guess sort of a bibliography, a minor bibliography of Svarim on these inyanim.
Okay, so first thing is one last source relating to in the times of the Rishonim learning. I told you I mentioned last time around that I'm looking for, do we know of yeshivas or in curriculums of yeshivas anything about it that they learned Moed Katan. So I just found that there was a sefer written in the third. It seems to be, it's unclear when it was written, but let's assume it was written in the 1300s. And it's a few pages. The manuscript survived that has a Seder Hayyim for the yeshivas, what to learn from a young age and on. So when it talks about learning Talmud, it says you should start with Zram. You should start with Zram, then move on, starting with Brachas, go on to Moed, you learn the entire Moed. Then you go on to Nashim and then to Nezikin, etc., etc. So it's clear, and they also had at the same time they did learn Mishnayos, let's say for Zram, where there's no Talmud Bavli. So we see that at least in this, it's very hard to know because we don't know much about this particular work. But we do see that they learned Moed Katan as a limud. It was official limud. Okay. Now Achronim is much harder, and I'll explain what I mean. It's much harder to know what was going on, and why is that? One would assume that by now, with so much literature out there, and we're constantly being supplied with more and more literature, that we would know a lot about the yeshivas from the Achronim. Achronim, I mean, let's say, from the Marshal, the Ramah, and onwards, or even a drop earlier, whenever the cutoff point of Rishonim and Achronim begins, and what they learned in the yeshivas. What Masechtas, what was the, let's say today we know there's what's called the Yeshivish Masechtas. What was the Yeshivish Masechtas in those days? And even though a lot has been written about the yeshivas, or attempt to collect a lot of information about the yeshivas, and one such person was a fellow Mordechai Breuer, did a very nice job in a sefer called a massive work called Alei Torah. But when you read the chapter about what was the exact curriculum, it's lacking. It's very hard. There's not so many sources. Now, it could be there really is sources. It's just that it requires a lot of research to figure this out. Anyway, bottom line is, and so I started to try to see, is there a way to figure out what Achronim learned in their yeshivas? So one very prominent, famous Achron early on was the Marsha. The Marsha, what's significant about the Marsha is that he emphasized in a few places in his writings that he only published, or in his Pirish, only material that he discussed with Talmidim. With his Talmidim, we know he was a very big Rosh Hashiva, and furthermore, in one place in one of his writings, he writes that he was at the Yurid, which was in those days like the big fair it took place for a few weeks, and he writes that since he was not able to, he was very busy, and at these Yuridim, they were very busy with dealing with the Gedolim, such as the Marsha. They were busy dealing with all different issues of the Klal, and many other things happened at this Yurid, talking about sometimes the big Dinei Torah had to be dealt with, etc., etc. So there was a few blot that he didn't give shir on. So we see. So anyway, but he emphasized this already in his Hakdama to his writings that he was that what he printed is with Talmidim. So what's significant is when you open up your Gemara Moed Katan today, in the back, you'll see that there's the Marsha on Moed Katan, even the Avelis part. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's pages and pages, but it's clear that he, according to what he describes, what his parish is about, that he gave shir on it. Now, what's more significant about this is a few years ago, a fellow named Yitzhak Yudelov wrote an incredible article where he documents showing that Masechtas, pretty much, let's say we just discussed the Yurid. So basically, at these Yurids, they would announce what Masechta is being learned. The Rosh Yeshivas were all there. They were the Gedolei Hadar of the time. They mostly would come in. They'd have all different types of meetings. And they also decided which Masechta, and all the yeshivas in Europe, however many there were, we don't even know how many there really were. We don't even know how many Talmidim there were, but whatever it was, they decided on one Masechta. So therefore, so now he maps out that his article that he's talking about is more that they used to use similar today. A lot of times, especially younger children, when they start learning Gemara, parents don't want them to ruin a whole Gemara, so they have this like paperback thing. It's you buy in the store on one parak. So in those days, they had like a paperback Gemara because Gemaras were very expensive and children were always children. So they also ruined it now. But the point is that he's able to document and show that throughout Europe they were learning the same Masechta. So now, possibly, it could be, I'm suggesting that if the Marshad did it, and he gave Shir Moed Katan, it could be that other yeshivas, but now, problem is, I don't know how many other yeshivas there were at the time. We're in the dark about this a lot. Anyway, but looking around, we see with some other Achrayim, assuming that this is true, other big Rosh Yeshivas, we don't really know how many Masechtas they really learned, how big was their yeshivish cycle, so to speak, if they learned Moed, or Moed Katan even. Okay, so it's a very hard thing to get to the bottom of. But as we move a little later, let's say into the mid 1700s, so we have there was a great gadol, the Karban Asanel, a Revial. We spoke a little bit about him in a previous. I think when we was talking about Tainus, I spoke about him and his relationship with his son Reb Yedidya Theophile. So his son, this Reb Yedidya that I mentioned then, he talks about his father. He says his father was Rosh Hashiva, which we know, and he taught Shas from beginning to end. Okay, now it's interesting is that if you open up your Rush in the back, so the Karban Asanel is one of the most important Perushim on the Rush, and you can see it's very thorough, even over here on Avelis. Interestingly enough, in the first presentation that we gave on Moed Katan about Rashi, so it's clear he knew something was up with Rashi because he's constantly referring to the Rashi and the Rif. Okay. Anyway, moving further along, another Yid, I believe he must have been a Rosh Hashiva at the time, Rabbi Yehuda Karlberg. So in a letter that he wrote to a friend in 1806, he also he's talking about some other things, and he says, by the way, I'm learning Masechtas Moed Katan, and here's a kasha that I have. But it's not clear if that's referring to his yeshiva. Could be he was learning it himself on the side. Okay. Anyway, but looking around, I still, as I said in the outset of the previous presentation, that research is ongoing. Okay, but now we move on to Litta. So Litta, so I said last time, let's say if you look in the Gra, of course, the Gra learned everything, all areas of Torah, it's not a question, but people that were somewhat influenced, not necessarily influenced by him directly, but in Litvish places, let's say on the first presentation, I spoke quickly about a Sefer Ksenis Pasim and a Taisus Aaron. They have a nice amount of literature on the Avelis sections of Avelis. Okay, but let's say we move to Volozhin. The actual yeshiva is Volozhin. Do we know what they learned in Volozhin at all? So now here, it's also interesting. Volozhin, we have a lot about the yeshiva. We have excellent work from Shol Stamfer available in Hebrew and in English. And he maps out so much about the yeshiva, and then there's a lot of other literature about the yeshiva. There's autobiography accounts of people that learned in the yeshiva. So you think you could find something what's going on in the yeshiva. And it's interesting is, it's famous, everyone knows, and Volozhin, they supposedly learned Shas from beginning to end. Now, what Stamfer is able to document, that he has some sources about it, and there is a more recent source, so to speak, because he didn't learn in Volozhin, but he has a direct Messiah, Rabbi Yasher Bar Soloveitchik, in his famous essay called Halachic Man. He also talks about how in the Volozhin, he says, they introduced the study of the entire Talmud from beginning to end, from Brachot to Nida. And they didn't skip over the Masechtas that weren't learned. Bottom line is that Reb Chaim gave shir on all areas, and so did the Netziv. That's what Rev Soloveitchik says. Now, from looking around in when Stamfer, when he talks about it, he does not have sources lemaisa. What was the curriculum, or even if there were shir given, how many people really attended? It's very weak. But so one place you will look is, I mentioned in one of the previous presentations, is that you look at the Moraimi Sada of the Netziv, because it seems that that's where shiurim. Interestingly enough, my Katan, there's nothing there. Okay, now to say that the Netziv didn't have what to say about my Katan is very strange, because if you open up the Hamek Sheila, he has tons of Torah related to Avelis, so he had what to say. So one answer is that even though the Moram Yisada does represent his shiurim, but it's not all his shiurim. I'm saying he was Rosh Yeshiva for many, many years. It's as a matter of fact, when I look for Ksuvis, there's almost nothing there. To say they didn't give shiur in Ksuvis, unlikely. Okay. Other people that learned in Volozhin or were affiliated with Volozhin, the Karanaya we spoke about last time, Minchas Yehuda, the Matzeves Maisha, these people, they all have about Moed Katan. But I was able to find one account of someone that learned in Volozhin who describes Volozhin in 1889. His name was Rabbi Yehuda Leib Dan Yechi. He says, when I came to Volozhin, they were learning Moed Katan. He's talking about 1889, and Lita, they learned Muzikin. Normally, he says, and then he says in his autobiography, he says, normally in Lita, they only learned Nazikin, Nasr and Nazikin. I never heard shir on this. So, and he said he didn't go to the shir, and he says, Arayim, I have charata that I didn't go to the shir. And others say that a lot of people didn't go to all the shiurim, especially, it sounds like when Chaim was giving shir on Kachim, people didn't go necessarily, it didn't talk to them as much as today to hear shir from Chaim. Who knows how many people will go running. Anyway, bottom line is that in Volozhin, it seems they did learn Moed Katan. How many times, for example, in all the 90 years of the yeshiva, we don't know, because we don't know much about it. It would fit with Volozhin, the Gadol, in that they did learn it. For example, there's a famous Ruach Chaim at the end of Parakei of Avos, where he says, well, when he talks about Hafach Hafach Kul Isba, he says, it's possible to learn out from Hilchus, a din in Hilchus Sukkah, it could help you for Aguna Shaila. He says, and there's other areas, there's no such thing as an area of Torah not being relevant. It could all play out in halacha, in learning, and everything. So the Volozhin tradition, it doesn't make sense that they would not learn Moed Katan. There's nothing against Moed Katan that they shouldn't have learned it. Now, but in the last presentation we were showing that it's possible that some people held that there's some type of sakana or everything. Do we find anything about in the Volozhin literature that maybe would deal with that? So there's other Masechtas, especially in more recent years, in Hasidic yeshivas for sure, and also in other places, that they don't like to learn with Bachrim, let's say Ksuvis, certain parts, and other Masechtas and other areas, Nida. And the question is, do you or shouldn't you learn it with Bachrim? Anyway, the Netziv, in an unbelievable piece in Parshas Matzayra, he talks about in the Parsha of Zav and Keri and all these inyanim. So he says that you might think, he has a whole beautiful piece, and the bottom line is he says, you might think that only Moshe heard it and that was it. He says, no, you're mechuyev, a Rebbe's mechuyev to teach it to his Talmidim. Aaron was mechuyev to teach it over to the rest of Klal Yisrael. And even though it's these inyanim of Ziva of Keri, that what happens is it triggers in the machshava. So you might think you should be mamayin and dibur and teaching it. He says, no, you should not. And then he says, he ends off, Uadin kol rav Talmidav, umishum shebe'em es belimud HaTorah, ein yoytzi ra. There's no such thing as ra coming out of it. So it could be you could take out from this amazing Netziv that possibly it would fit, and that's why they probably did learn Moed Katan. Anyway, just to conclude one last piece relating to Lita, that Deres. So I was asking Rabbi Binyamin Hamburger if he had sources about Moed Katan, so he sent me a line that Deres' autobiography, which I missed when going through it. Basically, when he was young, he writes he learned through all of Dalech Hilkei Shulchan Aruch in a year, but he skipped. And they learned, not only did they learn all Shulchan Aruch in 1 year, but they learned Even Ezer twice, but they skipped Siman Yud Zayin. Why? Someone told them to skip it. What's Siman Yud Zayin? It's a heter. One of the issues that talks about in Siman Yud Zayin is heter eshes ish shemeis bala. Okay, but interestingly enough, I was looking around and I came across, I don't know how I missed it when I how I missed it myself, but Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Sefer is Metzayin in his notes on the Sefer Hasidim to a tshuva of that deris in Ma'ana Eliyahu, Simon Kufchav Dalet. He says there was a Yid Rav Charney, a Rav that ended up coming to America, who corresponded a lot with Aderes. He learned in Volozhin, and this Rav was corresponding to Aderes, something to do with Hilchas Avelus, and he says something about a certain Rav, and then he says it seems the Rav didn't know a Pashut Halacha that was a Mefurish Halacha and Gemara and Tur Shulchan Aruch. He says not everyone knows this, and he says Kfar Shafti Zek Esrim Shana. Arav Echad Shetav Lo Yaleinu B'Hilchas Avelus. He says many people were chayshish not to learn these halachas based on the Sefer Hasidim that we discussed. The mefachi from this Masechta, and then he brings down that a Messiah, which is it's hard to find, I'm not able to locate it, but it's a Litvish Messiah that some people said they used to fast in the beginning of Moed Katan and Chulin. Okay, so Ad Kan, the Makairis that I found to date about Lita and Achreinim if they learned Moed Katan.
Wow, that's fascinating, especially the Maramakim of the Netziv in Parshas Mitzayra. One quick question: you mentioned the Karen Eira actually learned in Volozhin, or that was just part of what you were saying as Sfarim that wrote on Moed Katan?
So it's interesting is he's when I call Volozhin, I don't mean that I don't know where he's a Talmud of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. It could be some people call him really more like a Talmud Muvik of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. So no, sorry, no, I made a mistake once again. I already said this last a few times ago. Karen Eira did not learn in Volozhin, as far as I'm able to tell. Most people think he did. His brother, the Mishkanes Yaakov, did. Sorry, the Karen Eira. What I mean is the Karen Eira, but he's a Litvish Talmud. He was learned to Chavrusa many years with his brother, the Mishkanes Yaakov. He's very into the Gra. So him also, we see him learning intense Moed Katan. It fits in the Litvische, where I'm calling even the Gra tradition, and it would fit good with the Ruach Chaim anyway. But you're right, I made a mistake. It's not Volozhin. He did not learn Volozhin, at least according to my latest conclusion.
Okay, so again, let's wrap this up with the current or the modern day Poskim and the list of the Sfarim on Avelus.
Okay, so very quickly, Rav Moshe in the Sefer in the Messiah's Moshe, some people like it, some people don't. In volume 1 of Messiah's Moshe, he was asked about learning Avelus. He said it's not a problem, and he says he does. And okay, it sounds like it's not a problem according to Rav Moshe. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, interestingly, in a beautiful piece in the Halicha Shlomo on Tisha B'Av, page Taf Lamed Tes, he says that he held that you could learn it. It's not a problem. He knew about the Chassam Sofer that we quoted in the previous, where people showed that Chassam Sofer is chayshish, and he said that many Talmidei Chacham are not expert in this area. When he was a young person, he went bedafka to learn it. Not only that, when he gave shiurim to Balabatim for 50 years, he made sure that they learned this also. And he held it's a very important area of Torah you should learn. And you could see in Lamashal Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasa, he has a lot of, he deals with this a lot. Now, more than that is that I once came across a piece, one of the Sfarim, one of the most famous in recent decades on Hilchos Avelus is the Gesher Chaim from Rav Tukashinsky, famous for the Luach Eretz Yisrael. So he wrote the Sefer Gesher Chaim. So already so he's a generation really before Reb Shlomo Zalman. So in the beginning of one volume, he has a series of tshuvas which he asks. He says, I'm asking a few different Gedolim, Rav Herzog, Rav Tzibes Frank, and then he says, I'm asking a Yid Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he says he's an upper-coming star. That's how he refers to him already. This is in the early 40s. And it seems there's other tshuvas in Hilchos Avelus, particularly with Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rav Tukashinsky. Rebel Yashiv. So a few years ago, a massive sefer came out on Hilchos Avelus from a Talmud of Rebel Yashiv with questions that he asked Rebel Yashiv. It's hundreds of pages. We're talking about over 700 pages. In the beginning of the work, he talks about, should you learn Hilchos Avelus? He says, of course, you have to learn a Be'iyom like all years of Torah. There's nothing to worry about, said Rebel Yashiv. He says, what about the Chassam Sofer? Nothing. You should learn it, and it's fine. You don't have to be chayshish for the Chassam Sofer about it. Now, and Lamaisa, it's an excellent sefer of all different halachas of Hilchos Avelus in a give and take manner with his Talmud over here. I remember when I was learning in the Near, And I remember going by Rabbi Yashiv in those days. It was going back to 25 years approximately. Rabbi Yashiv was giving shir daily in Moed Katan, and you could go into the local. I think you still could get shiurim of Rabbi Yashiv on Masechtas Moed Katan. To conclude, this is with the Reb Chaim Kanievsky. Today, you always have to quote Reb Chaim Kanievsky in these type of inyanim. Reb Chaim Kanievsky also says you can learn Moed Katan, it's not a problem. Torah is not mazik, which fits into what we were learning up to now. He says if you want, you can give some tzedakah. And this psak of Reb Chaim Kanievsky is quoted in multiple different svarim. But really, his father, the stipler I saw recently, also said a similar such thing. Ad kan, the psakim of some of the more recent Gedolei Hadar that we've had that talk about Avelis.
Rabbi Eliezer, let's close this out with a list of svarim on Hilchos Avelos and the like.
Okay. So first we have printed recently from manuscript, the Markeves HaMishnah wrote a chibur called Eivel Hashitim, Matzavis Moshe in the back of the Chachmas Adam from the Chai Adam. Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Golus in the back of Yeridea has a similar type of work as he's famous for in Shari Tshuva with his brother. There's a Sefer Chaim Ubracha, excellent Sefer Al Pi the Seder Aleph Beis, Chashav Askamas from Meir Simcha, the Marsham, beautiful Sefer. Then you have more. If you go a little more recent, you'll have the Kolbay Hilchos Avelos from Yikasil Greenwald, excellent Sefer. It was originally printed under a different name. It was updated. It's 2 parts. A lot of people don't know about the other part. Then you have, if you go more, we mentioned already the Gesher Chaim. There's a more contemporary Sefer Pnei Baruch. Just on one aspect of Hilchos Avelos, we have on Hilchos Kriya, Reb Shrei Dublitzky wrote a Sefer Zichron Betzalel. More recently was updated, and incredible askama from Rev Ephraim Greenblatt, where he says how every Rav should know about the Sefer, a be'iyundik Sefer on every prat on Hilchos Kriya. Okay, then just to conclude, 2 other areas. One is on Kaddish. Kaddish, it causes all the fights, many fights. Who should be for the Amud also. So there's a sefer from a fellow David Asaf Kaddish available on Hebrew books. A more recent sefer called Dibras Moshe. And much earlier, not everyone knows about the Rabbi Ephraim Zalman goes in the back of Mata Ephraim has a chibur on Kaddish Yassim. And to conclude, when we talk about Misa and Inyanim of death and everything relating to a lot of these halachas, so one of the earliest svarim was the Maver Yavik, which was the Sefer. You look even ready in Chachmas Adam, how he quotes it often, but even earlier. And there was a Sefer Chaim, which was printed numerous times on Hilchos Avelos. For a bibliography of many svarim on Hilchos Avelos, one can look in the back of both volumes of Nittig Avril, available on Hebrew books. Each one has many of the different svarim that are out there in Hilchos Avelos. What we see from all this is Avelos was learned, but it might be that it was learned only more by Meirei Ara as opposed to Hamoinam.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for coming back 3 times for Moed Katan. Hope everybody will enjoy these 3 episodes, and looking forward to doing it again sometime soon. Thank you very much.